I'd like to announce that we're pleased to have collaborated with the Institute of Canadian Citizenship to bring a little bit of 6 degrees to the Future Cities Canada Summit. We greatly appreciate your organization's commitment to inspiring inclusion among new and long-standing Canadians from coast to coast. And leading this session, I'd like to introduce Yasir Naqvi, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. You will also know them as ICC. And prior to joining ICC, Mr. Naqvi served as an MPP for almost 11 years in Ottawa, amongst other seats in offices, law, academia, and nonprofits. Yasir, please, you're already there, so please tell us a little bit more about the 6 degrees model, and walk us through the session, and look forward to introducing our extraordinary speakers. Everyone, let's give it up for Yasir.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. Adil, thank you for that kind introduction. It's a great honor for us to be here as part of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship and partner with Future Cities Canada and engage in this very important discussion around how does one build inclusive communities. You will see that the format is slightly different than what you've been exposed to. So the session that we're part of right now is not going to be a debate. In fact, this is going to be a conversation, and there will be opportunities for you to participate in that conversation as well. So what we are going to be taking some time talking about this morning and bleeding into the afternoon is about inclusive placemaking. How do we build communities? How do we build places? Not from a tangible infrastructure perspective. We're not talking about ramps and accessible doors. They are very important to make sure that everybody surrounding us are included. But we want to talk about how do we engage people? How do we ensure that people feel included when communities are being developed? That they have an opportunity to co-create spaces in our neighborhoods, whether they are urban or rural or suburban. And that's an important conversation. And the reason that process is important because it speaks to belonging. We own our spaces and our places when we feel that we belong, that we're part of that community. And we at the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, the work that we do with new Canadian citizens and other citizens in Canada and abroad, we found that the process of belonging takes many different forms for people. We do citizenship ceremonies in very public places like art galleries and museums and parks so that people can create a connection to those spaces and start seeing them in a different manner. We have a program called Canoe where we allow people, new Canadian citizens, to have access to art galleries and museums and national and provincial parks for free for 1 year so that they can start building that connection as well. And then through our 6 degrees, which is the Global Forum for Inclusion, our focus is to then talk in real jarring terms what that process looks like. Let me tell you quickly my story. I came to Canada over 30 years ago, 1 month shy of being a 16-year-old. In a new environment, in the middle of winter, it was Boxing Day. We didn't get the memo on cold. And it was being in a new place. It was not the home that I knew. And the question became, well, how does this become home? And my family and I did not know the answer. And when you fast forward about 10 years or so, and I had moved to Ottawa to attend law school, and I thought I was just going to Ottawa to attend school, I distinctly remember the moment. The one day that I was walking towards school, I was on Laurier Bridge, crossing, and I stopped at the moment at the bridge. I looked to my right, it was the Rideau Canal. I looked to my left, I saw the Chateau Laurier and the Parliament Hill with the Peace Tower. And the thought just came to my mind. This is where I belong. This is my home. And I made Ottawa my home. I'm raising my family there. But I've thought about that moment quite a bit. what was it that made me feel all of a sudden that Ottawa was my home? And I realized that first of all, it was really not the canal or the Parliament Hill, those physical pieces, although they are important, nor that process was all of a sudden. It was over time, the space, the nature of the community, the people around me that made me felt welcome, the accessibility to institutions like the Parliament or natural venues like the Ottawa River or the Rideau Canal. It was a combination of things that defined the city of Ottawa as a place where I felt that I belong. And it's a process that happens at different pace for different people. So today, this morning, that's the conversation we want to have, is how do you define these places? How do you make these spaces? What role you and I can play in making places inclusive? And by making them inclusive, we foster belonging. So I'm going to invite our very first member of the panel, Aubin. Aaron, please join me here. Yes. Please. So, Aaron, I want to take the conversation to a larger communities, and to talk about how does one brings a particular community into making a place. Can you share with us your guiding principles that you use in designing spaces, and how do you engage people and make them feel that their contributions are valuable?
Thank you. So I just wanted to start by thanking Elder Redbird this morning for our land acknowledgement, and Lindy yesterday for a land acknowledgement. My cultural name is Guasalaz. It was given to me through ceremony. And the foundation of my culture is giving and sharing wisdom and knowledge. And that's the work we do with community. And how we create the work we do is by co-creation, by first and foremost listening and understanding what a community is looking to do, and how do we empower their voice to engage on that idea that they want to collaborate. And then we start designing with them, and then not taking that process over, but more importantly, supporting the process and supporting them where we can do. So the type of work we do is we like to try and be the 10% rather than the 90%. So that's kind of the process. It's about co-creation. It's about a lot of listening and a little bit of talking.
Yeah. And so your work is with Indigenous communities.
Correct.
Across the country. So can you share with us a bit about the successes and challenges in the work that you have done with Indigenous consultations and Indigenous-led planning?
Yeah, absolutely. Just a few months ago, I wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail talking about ethical space and how do we create ethical space. And one of the things that I've learned in this work through the guidance of elders is traditional knowledge and Western knowledge. And how do we not bring them together, but how do we create a space where we can leverage the wisdom and knowledge from both of those processes? And that space between those two things is what we call ethical space. So where we share values, we share purpose, and then we're able to move forward in very meaningful conversations. So in a lot of conversations, that's the foundation of how we do our engagement. The other side of that is how do we do planning that's community-led? And so as a former chair of Indigenous planning with the Canadian Institute of Planners, you know, that was one of the aspirations that we had, is how do we help support communities? Because the wisdom and knowledge is within those communities themselves. You know, I may be a registered professional planner, one of the very few in Canada that's First Nation, but the reality that I've learned in my work was that the wisdom is in those elders, it's in the youth, it's in the community. And I like that. The community is our superhero, and that resonates well with me and the work we do with our communities that we work with.
Backstage, you and I were talking, and we were just getting on the discussion around a fatigue around consultations. Oh. You know, there's a lot of, rightly so, emphasis in making sure that we consult with Indigenous communities and have their perspective, but there's a lot that is happening, and I think there's a perception at times as well that we're sharing our perspective. Is it being listened to? how do you deal with that perception? How do you deal with that fatigue element, especially when elders who have to travel long distances to come to these processes?
Well, that's one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of elders are being asked to participate in processes or to provide land acknowledgements and things like that, and they have to travel long distances. So it is a really real concern. One of the things that we're working on right now is actually building a cultural center in Calgary where we can bring elders together, where they can be in a space where people will come to them rather than them having to go to everywhere else in the country for these conversations. So it's one of the things that our firm's really supportive of. And the other side is that the other component of fatigue is also the financial side of it. When you compensate an elder, I was just at the Wachitowin conference in Saskatoon a few weeks ago, and the elders were talking about that the compensation is just not there yet, and we need to make sure that they're properly compensated. No different than a consultant or an expert would be compensated. They need to be compensated fairly because their livelihoods are important to sustaining that wisdom and knowledge that we need in our processes.
Great, thank you. So, friends, as you probably remember, I mentioned that this is a two-way conversation, which means that you have an opportunity to engage in this conversation as well. We at 6 Degrees firmly believe that the notion of expanding circle from Indigenous communities, that information should not just flow from this circle outwards, but should come inwards as well. So I have two of my friends who have these very bright catch boxes. So David Leonard on my left-hand side, and Kayla Gray. Kayla, where are you with this blue catch box? So these are nice, warm, fuzzy, cuddly microphones. So you can talk into them. The trick is, so David will demonstrate, see he's catching it around. They kind of act like volleyballs. The trick is that you have to hold them really closely to your sort of chest and your mouth to speak into them, and they act like a proper microphone. So we're going to try that out right now, and I want to hear from one of the members of the audience or two to talk if you have any experience in success and failure in building and engaging authentic communities. If you have done this kind of work in your community, do you want to share how did you go about it, and were you successful or not?
Who wants to share?
Over here? Anyone? Over here? Someone? Let's be brave. Oh, I see a hand right there. Are you ready to catch?
I'm just going to start giving it to people.
I'll come close.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Does this work? Yeah. So we build Arctic greenhouses. We work with local food security in communities remotely around Canada. And so one of the first things that we did, or rather that people asked us, was, why don't you just build the greenhouse like tomorrow? It doesn't take that long to actually build. And the biggest thing that we always said, well, we believe in food sovereignty. We want these community projects to be just that, a community project. And so when we started to build these relationships in these communities, we really let them take the reins. From like the design of the greenhouses, our name is Green Igloo because it literally looks like an igloo, and the local community members called it that. The way that it was structured, what we grow inside, how we grow inside, it was really led by the community. And that is what we've taken to other communities. We always just tell them, this is what worked in X community. You might want to try it, but we're open. We're all open ears. We don't want to be that organization that comes in, tells you what you want, and then gives it to you and leaves. We try to build from the ground up with communities. So that's how we build our authentic relationships in these communities.
Can you share a specific example of a failure that you may have encountered trying to do that kind of building an authentic community?
For sure. Our organization is about 6 years old, and when we first started, we took for granted that here in the South, we work with a lot of Indigenous communities, and in the South, we learn about planting and harvesting, and we see trees grow outside of our houses. And when we started our educational platform that is paired with all of our technology, we learned that a lot of this isn't innate for people that have never seen a tree grow outside their house, right? And so a very big communication gap there in our educational plans was we just figured that they were taught the same exact things that we were. As a result of that, learning about germination and harvesting, et cetera, should start here. When in reality, we actually had to go back and replace all of our education, working with the local community to understand where those educational gaps existed, fill them in, and be able to provide that education on forth to other communities.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that. So now you know how this works. right? This was not a plan, by the way, so that was good. Thank you. So I want to take this conversation to sort of building on some of the failures is how does one identify gaps when we're doing the inclusive placemaking and the techniques that go into problem solving them. And I really, to dive into this a little, I want to welcome our good friend Rodney Small to please come forward from Nova Scotia. Look at that, Rodney. You brought your own band. I like it. Style. This is good stuff. So, Rodney, you work with One North End and have been driving a group to sort of problem solve in Halifax. And we were having a very animated conversation earlier about some of the challenges that you identified and how you resolve those challenges. Share with everybody for their understanding the problems around North End of Halifax and what challenges what that community was facing.
Well, first and foremost, I think it's very important to point out that my story is a little different than Yasir here, and unlike Yasir, I'm not an immigrant to Canada, and in fact, I'm Indigenous to these lands, and many people may not know, but the farther I go west, the more I lose my culture, and nobody understands that there's an Indigenous black population located back in Nova Scotia that predates Confederation significantly. In fact, we've been there for close to 530 years. So with that being said, I think that helps us kind of establish the place where we come into really calling that place home. In fact, people that moved to Toronto and been here for many generations and had kids, their kids still claim Nova Scotia as down home. So I think that's really important to point out, because right now, what Nova Scotia has done very well is they've hid their blackness, and Halifax displaced it very well. And in saying so, I encourage each and every one of you to look up the story of Africville. That's where my people would have came from, and understand how that story of Africville led to the displacement of many of us, which migrated to the north end of Halifax. And I think it's really important to point out that we had a very special lady that ran a business out of the north end of Halifax that is nationally renowned now, and she's on our $10 bill. So if none of you don't know, her name is Viola Desmond. And Viola Desmond, Viola Desmond is also the very powerful woman that decided to sit down in a theater 2 years before Rosa Parks sat on the bus. But Canada, once again, hid its blackness. So this was, a part of the civil rights movement. These are very important stories that we have to learn how to share collectively across our nation, and ultimately really introduce it into our public school curriculum. So for us, that displacement piece is really close to home, in fact, close to my heart. And in the north end of Halifax, similar to what several of you are familiar with here, because based on my experience in having family in Toronto, in both Regent Park and Parkdale, gentrification is a real thing. And it's happening in the north end of Halifax. Funny enough, I remember 20 years ago in the north end of Halifax, students would come in, 80% of our student population, by the way, comes from Ontario. Students would come in and they would be encouraged not to go to the north end of Halifax. What I can tell you, it's the prime spot to be in this country today. And when you can go on an airplane and read the north end of Halifax is the place to be, that's mind-boggling to me, and it blows my mind. So when I seen that our community leaders, our youth, and our activists were detached from these conversations, I had to figure out a way with my people in order to create what I consider a brave space so that we can have healthy dialogue on how we can move forward together.
So, thank you for first setting the context as to who you are and where you came from, because I think it's very important. And Aaron, you did it, and I did it, because I think it shapes our perspective, and it's important that others understand the perspective. You spoke of gentrification, and that was the challenge that North End was facing. And a lot of us have seen this, and we continue to see this in our respective communities. In your experience, who you were seeing was left behind and how, and we talked about a little bit about this as well. And is it a question of infrastructure? Is it a question around jobs and housing? In your view, when gentrification is taking place, what's your definition? What's manifesting it?
Well, I think it doesn't come down specifically to my definition. One of the things we do in engaging community is make sure we carry that voice forward. There's no sense of engaging the community and not carrying that voice forward. That means you weren't sincere and you weren't genuine. And if you're going to go in there, your trust is going to be destroyed, so probably not a great place to start them types of conversations. So for me, we have to carry those voices forward. And what we heard from our youth is gentrification. What does that mean? Oh, it's called the takeover. So we have people coming in and taking over our community. So the language itself becomes a barrier. So by attaching our youth and our activists to these conversations, we start to mobilize. And who are being left behind? Well, people that look like me, visible minorities. It's easy. It becomes a no-brainer because when we think of gentrification, well, we have to be able to go to the root cause. And we start to look at, well, the systematic racism that are attached to gentrification, and then go a little farther and look at the multi-generational poverty that has been created through displacement, such as stories of Africville. That was prime land. Okay, prime land that was taken away from us. We have no equity. I can't go to the bank and put up, my equity if I want a loan to do a business per se. So if I want to start my own business, by the way, in a traditional black community back in the north end of Halifax, there's no black businesses. So we don't represent the population we serve. It's completely ridiculous. What was said was we were seeing all these new businesses popping up, and they weren't hiring our kids. So it was an issue. And then when we talk about, gentrification, well, we're talking about people being pushed out of a community that ultimately what happens is the developers end up coming in and driving up the rents. And when you drive up the rents, then what we end up talking about is it affordable housing or is it accessibility? Because in many cases, what ends up happening is they also get to set what that affordable price tag means. And when you drive up rents that become twofold, I remember at one point in time, literally over 2 years ago, you can find a place in the north end of Halifax for $650 for a 2-bedroom. Ha! Them days are long gone, I can promise to tell you. In fact, nowadays, $1,400 is the going. Okay? So what would be considered below market in that case would be $1,000. Still not affordable for the people I grew up with living in poverty, plain and simple.
So I want to bring Aaron in because I think one of the things that we're identifying is that communities are changing around us without people who are part of those communities having a say in it. When you're doing these consultations, what's the key ingredient? How do you then earn the, I guess trust is the word, of the people saying, no, we're recreating or co-creating these places and your input really matters. What's the model looks like for those conversations, Aaron?
Well, I think one of the key things is being genuine about the conversation that you're having and really trying to activate that information that's being shared. And a lot of the work that we're doing is how do we help take that information that's sometimes coming from a very traditional perspective, using traditional words and traditional ceremonies in some cases, and reflect that in a very Western system, which doesn't understand ceremony. And similarly on a Western side, when we have boardroom meetings, that doesn't really translate into a ceremony that you might have facilitated in a cultural building, such as a teepee or a big house in my nation. So it's about how do you bring those conversations together, how do you merge the information and help both narratives work together. And so I think that's probably the biggest piece of it is how do we create that genuine space for people to have conversation. And I think that's what we need more of in this country is more genuine dialogue where we're informing and working with both processes, not trying to say, well, we need to completely work in a Western process where you've got to come to an open house and certain day of the week and you've got 2 seconds on the microphone to share your thought. When an elder shares their thoughts with us in a meeting, sometimes it could be 1 minute, sometimes it can be 25 minutes. We don't cut that conversation off. We listen to that wisdom and knowledge. We take that in, we reflect and understand, and then we try and see how that can shape the work we do collectively. And I really emphasize the word collectively because it's really critical that Indigenous people feel part of our cities in Canada. We do a lot of work within the major cities in Canada, and they need to feel part of these cities. And a lot of these cities still have natural spaces where Indigenous people still use those spaces, parks and river valleys and things like that. They gather medicines. They still have sacred spaces within our cities. And they still have a wisdom, or a great deal of wisdom in those spaces that we need to empower and protect those spaces as well.
So it's amazing how you're really sort of talking about how you basically the gap that had existed where communities and Indigenous knowledge was not being consulted and turning that into an opportunity. And Rodney, I know you've engaged in that work, but before I do that, I just want to forewarn all of you that I'm going to be coming out to you, so start maybe thinking of some specific examples where in your work you have been able to fill those gaps with opportunities. Rodney, what did you do in North End of Halifax? How did you address that issue of displacement that was taking place and turn it around into an opportunity for the community?
So for us, we hit the ground twofold. And when I say we hit the ground twofold, we had to connect with the credible messengers on the ground. In order to connect to what we consider our vulnerable part of our community, which are the voices that are completely overlooked. And in many cases, that were people, once again, that look like myself. So we started with our youth, and we took those conversations directly into our junior high schools, and we had focus groups around the challenges that our young people were facing, simply just to be happy people in society. And lo and behold, our young people were in tune, and they started identifying the issues that they were facing, and guess what came up? We call them the 3 E's: employment, education, and, well, not the third E, but we said justice. So 2 E's and then justice. And then lo and behold, we went a little deeper because we had these siloed conversations. So we engaged the youth, and we say, okay, if you're going to engage the youth, then well, you got to engage parents too. But we don't want to engage them in the same space, okay? Because if you engage them in the same space, we're not sure we're going to have that bravery that we needed to establish in order to make sure that we're hearing, having a sincere conversation. So then we have to, go a little farther and hear from the parents. And lo and behold, what we started to identify is that there has been no change from one generation to the next, simply through engaging our community in a healthy and sincere manner. We continue to carry those conversations out to our new members of our community, and we intentionally brought our elders into that space purposely to create that learning opportunity and healthy dialogue. Lo and behold, we've been carrying those conversations forth into government spaces and other places, and as I was explaining to you yesterday, actually Aaron yesterday, one of the young men that was a founder of the One North End, he has since established the courage to put his name forth, and he's now one of the youngest counselors in our country, and that's Mr. Lindell Smith. So, I mean, when we can create spaces that actually give our young people the courage to put their name forth, to go into positions of power, then lo and behold, we are creating healthy dialogue and ensuring that the people in our community know that there's a long history of first and foremost displacement, and secondly, we have to learn to have these conversations, which many of us are scared to have, because ultimately that's where we're going to find our growth.
What a great example of turning that gap and into an opportunity to the point where somebody's actually ran for office and now is a decision maker, which is great. So this room is full of problem solvers, and a lot of you have been involved in this kind of activities. Let's hear your techniques. What have you been able to do in the work in your respective communities or line of work and turn those gaps into opportunities that has worked? David and Kayla are here with with the catch boxes. Somebody wants to share their success and how they were able to accomplish it? Don't be shy. All right. As you're all thinking, I'm going to bring our third panel member, Seema Jethalal, to Jethalal, right? Got it right? Seema, please come forward. Good round of applause for Seema. Thanks. Clearly, you didn't bring your band with you today. Yeah, your band. You can give her a little note now. Right? You can give her a little note now. Here we go.
Thank you.
So, Seema, I want to bring your conversation. You've been really sort of active in sort of bridging the gap in the hierarchy between from grassroots to large institutions where the decisions tends get to be made. You've done this kind of work that Aaron and Rodney are describing personally and professionally in many parts of the country. Want to hear your experience being part of the co-creation process. But before we do that, tell us about the manifesto, the Streets project that you worked on, and what lessons did you learn from that?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I also just want to give thanks to Elder Duke Redbird and Lindy for starting us off in such a beautiful way yesterday and today. And just by also way of introduction, because now we know where everyone else is from, just to situate myself in the context of also being a settler here. My folks came from apartheid South Africa, born and raised in Durban, and my ancestors are from Gujarat, India. So just to give you that context. I would love to tell you about this really amazing initiative that I got a chance to work on just over a decade ago now in Regent Park, when I was working for Manifesto Community Projects. It still blows my mind to see my name on a screen that says that I work for the federal government, because if you have known me for a long time, you'll know that I came from working in community and grassroots sectors with young people of color mostly. And so I think this is an interesting example because it actually, so much of what I learned from the community and the wisdom that I gathered from the young people we were working with has completely underpinned the work that I did subsequently, running an arts and cultural center in Regent Park, and now working at the Department of Canadian Heritage. So what happened was, at the time, I think it was 2008, Manifesto Community Projects, which was known for running Canada's largest hip-hop festival at the time, but also did a lot of work in advocacy and alternative arts education program. We were approached by Luminato, which was a sort of in its early stages at that point, to produce a street art exhibition that would be anchored in multiple sites, anchored in Regent Park and would happen across the city in various sites. And the plan that they gave us was still evolving, and they said, look, we've got this great American curator, he's got some wonderful ideas for international artists that we'd like to bring to Regent Park, and we'd love to, we'd love for you guys to help produce this so that they can set up some really powerful street art exhibitions in Regent. So I worked with Devin and Che and Ryan, and I don't know if any of them are here, and a few others, and we said, this is really interesting, but we want to completely rewrite the script. So yes, we'll do it, but we'd love to get some agency to challenge the plan and to do it a bit differently. So we took this on, and essentially what we started by doing was very much what Rodney and Aaron seem to do a lot, which is we went into the community and we listened. And one thing I love that Duke taught me many years ago was that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I think this is a common sort of philosophy in various Indigenous cultures of we should spend more time being in listening mode in community. And we really wanted to not just parachute in and out, but to do something that would be far more meaningful, far more inclusive. We wanted to avoid poverty tourism and any sort of, we didn't want to sort of share the same narrative that people already had about Regent. We wanted to show the beauty and the vibrancy of the community. So we worked with a whole bunch of, what did you call them, Rodney? Credible messengers. Love it. Community leaders from Pathways to Education and Dixon Hall and Regent Park Focus and other neighborhood organizations. And we decided not to work with international artists, but rather to focus mostly on Canadian artists and Indigenous artists. And we identified 15 young people, some of whom knew that they had a passion for the arts, other people who'd never had a chance to explore it or didn't necessarily identify as artists. We set up a 3-month workshop program that was facilitated by Ravi Jain, who's the artistic director of Why Not Theatre, who's all about doing things differently and flipping the model on its head. And he worked with these young people over 3 months, and we kind of co-created the curriculum as we went along, as we got to know the youth. All the while, taking the time during this very complicated, the outset of the revitalization in Regent Park, to take the time to let these young people figure out how they felt about what was happening to their community, to ask the questions about what is your family going through, what's your story, what is it about your identity that you would want to share. And then we actually worked with each of the different amazing artists, like street art photographers and different muralists and seventh-generation image makers and so on. Every week they would actually train the young people in their art form, all the while taking the time to co-create their exhibition piece with the youth, allowing the young people to tell their stories through the artwork that they were co-creating. And Ravi also supported them in kind of finding their voice so that they could actually become tour guides for the actual exhibition. So it was a pretty unique undertaking. And it was a pretty powerful opportunity, I think, for us to learn from these youth, for the artists who were creating site-specific work inspired by the young people they were working with, and for the community. And you asked what I learned from it. I would say a core value that really got crystallized in that for me was around designing for people at the margins, because when you design for people at the margins, everyone gets included. It was really about reframing risk as investment. It was really about challenging what's handed to you and really thinking about process as equally, if not more important than where you're going. It was about really thinking hard about how we can rise by lifting others. So a lot of that became really central to what we did, and then, as I mentioned, has just helped shape me into the person that I am now and the work that I do now.
It's a great example, and I mean, it's an amazing, again, example of empowerment and, taking young people who probably always been marginalized, felt they had no voice, and bringing them in the middle of the room, I think is fascinating. Aaron and Rodney have been talking about issues around trust and credibility and lived experiences and the role they play in these meaningful conversation we're having around placemaking. How do you pair that with the institutions, the structural institutions that we have, and the decision making, especially at the government level that we see? How do you, from your experience, how do we match both of them together?
It's hard. I think especially now that I'm finding myself in a place where I'm in a massive bureaucracy that often has had a history and continues to have a history of mistrust with a lot of folks here on this land. It's not easy. And in my career trajectory, I've kind of gone from really small organization to medium organization to now I'm with 2,000 people in my department. And so I think the larger the institution, the more the mistrust. And I think part of it has to do with, us as leaders, and I really, I look up to you both for this as well. I think it's about operating from a place of empathy, operating from a place of compassion, and just really trying to leverage the agency that we have to help the folks that are farther behind in their struggle for liberation to get to the place that we've been able to get to. So, for example, in Regent, after doing that project, when I started managing Daniel Spectrum, the cultural hub there, like, who were we to come in and set up this community center mashup with performing arts meets co-working space? It was a very complicated thing to do at a very complicated time. And I think part of the way that we built the trust was, I guess, two things. One was the people, and the other was the process. The people is, we made it a point at the time to make sure we hired at least half of our staff of 40 from the local community, but not just in entry-level positions. It was also about, okay, how do we think about this holistically from the decision-making power that they have, from all the boards and advisories and the committees, et cetera. How do we make sure that they're involved and the people that are not at those tables are involved meaningfully in the decision-making? So it was really, it's many things. It's thinking about how you're procuring your supplies, where are you getting them from? It's about the leadership. It's about all aspects. It's not just, let's make sure we have gender parity, or let's make sure we've got a youth voice at the board table. Like, it's really thinking more so about that. And I think when you do that, you're really putting your money where your mouth is, and you're sharing your power. I loved what Zara was saying earlier. It's about sharing that power, because ultimately everyone, I think anyways, everyone wins when you do that.
Yeah. I'm going to take this opportunity again to get all of you involved. You're hearing some very interesting experiences and real techniques as to how these three people have been involved in the work they've been doing and with the communities. Why don't I give you an opportunity to maybe share a story, again, of success or failure in the work that you may be doing around building inclusive spaces, tactics, or if you may have a question for our panel members. See, Prince right here. And go ahead.
Everyone, my name is Marina Queirolo, and I work at Evergreen, and I am one of my biggest techniques that I've used and I've learned because I've applied over the years is the power of yes. And so I didn't know it existed until I started sort of implementing programs on the ground. And over the years, I've been fortunate enough to be working with the Mexican community to organize Day of the Dead on site. And it's helped me redefine, first, the power of yes, second, the power of process, and third, the power of partnerships. So we use this word all the time. We say, oh, we're partners. But what does it mean to be partners when you have a playground like this one with lots of access to resources, and you have partners that are in very different places? And so I think it's really important when you're thinking of placemaking and making places that are inclusive, and you really want to empower the community to feel welcome and a sense of ownership in this place, is that you're just playing a backbone support. You're in the back, you're just enabling them, listening a lot and saying yes to many of their ideas and helping them through the process. And maybe you have certain standards or certain things that you want to deliver that way, but really that's not the important part. The important part is for them to learn through that process and grow with you, and also learn how it is important to have recurrency from one year to other. So we've grown this festival many times. The work that we do, we have to satisfy our funders with very, very short-term deliverables, whereas building community and making change and creating a place doesn't come from one day to another. So the first year we did Day of the Dead, we had probably 50 Mexicans, Latins that came. And now the 9th, we had like 3,000 that came. And the site suddenly was full of people speaking in Spanish. So we were a majority, we weren't a minority. And so I think time, saying yes, being supportive and not taking a lead role is really important when you're thinking about place. And I think that can be applied to this place or to any other circumstances.
Great, thank you very much. Process was an interesting point, and I think all the work that all of you have been involved in co-creating spaces, the process is never the same. It changes. Erin, how do you define the process when you're working with Indigenous communities?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment on the last speaker there, and we talk about places such as this, and how do we create places like this where Indigenous people can gather in a place that's safe for them. And Rodney and I were talking about strong places, or places where we can be strong in space and contribute. And one of the challenges is how do we go through a process to create something like that? And is it a square? Is it a circle? And I really appreciate the circle we're in here today on this stage, which is really empowering, because the power of a circle is really amazing. And I think that when we talk about process, we have to have inclusion of many different voices. And we have to have inclusion of our elders, our youth, and then we also have to have inclusion of non-Indigenous people as well in these conversations, because we create places for everyone, not just for a small few. And that's the really important part about it. When you start building process, it's about designing with everyone. I find it really hard to tell somebody what they're going to do on Friday night, what restaurant they're going to go to, and what movie they're going to see. I don't get a lot of support for that. When I ask, well, what do you want to do Friday night? Where do you want to eat? What movie do you want to see? When we do it together, we're a lot more successful, and people feel like they're really heard. and that they can actually have an input. And so in the cultural center we're creating in Calgary, we've got about 50 to 60 different elders that are participating actively in that process. But one of the things that comes with process is responsibility and expectations. And that's the hard part, because when we're working through a lot of institutions trying to break through barriers and trying to say that we want to do something different, we want to do something that's uniquely Indigenous, that has a different look to it. What does that look like? It takes a lot of time to get people to think differently. When we start talking about big price tags of 60, 70, $100 million to build a cultural center, it's like, wow, that's a lot of money. Well, you look around the cities that we live in, and there's hundreds of millions of dollars invested in buildings everywhere. But how many of those buildings in the city are Indigenous? How many places in our city practice and celebrate Indigenous culture? Not very many. And so we looked across the country and actually internationally at different cultural centers that are around the world, and there are very few of them. And Calgary doesn't have one. And there's other cities across Canada that don't have Indigenous cultural centers where they can celebrate language, song. I love the performance yesterday afternoon at the end of our day, sharing and expressing our thoughts about how we want to communicate, because communication isn't always written. And that was the one fundamental in terms of process. Process is not about writing, it's about oral. And a lot of our elders share their wisdom and knowledge orally. And so when we put them into a process and just fill out this form, can you just put your thoughts down in this report? Can you, and I had to correct one of my colleagues once, and I said, so how did you facilitate your process? And he goes, well, we sent them a form. And I looked at him, and he looked back at me, and he goes, I know, we failed. I said, you've got to start talking. And we've got to take ourselves out of buildings, out of structures, and putting ourselves on the land. We need to empower Indigenous conversations on the land, because as I walk outside, beautiful day today, and I look at nature, and I think there's stories in all of those plants. There's stories about on the land, but we put ourselves in four walls, and we try and empower that conversation. It really limits us. And so when we do engagement, we take the elders and we put them on the land. We talk outside, and then all of a sudden, we're not in a deficit anymore. We're in a surplus of wisdom and knowledge because they're activated by the outdoors. They can take a particular plant and say, this is what this does and why this is important to our heart or our soul. And then they feel more and more rich to share. So I'll leave it there.
Great, Mel. Thank you. Thank you. I think there's somebody right behind you. I can't see who wants to make a comment. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Wendy and I'm with One Up Toronto. I'm actually a high school student, and I want to say I think I'm one of those things, and One Up Toronto is one of those things that's filling that missing gap you're talking about. Today I've heard a lot of people say we need youth voices, we need to hear the voice of the youth. But one thing I've not heard is that we need youth to do things. We need to not only have their voice, but we need to act on their voice. So what One Up Toronto does is we have given the opportunity to students across the Toronto, across GTA, so including those suburbs in Richmond Hill, North York, Mississauga, and we're giving them the opportunity to identify those long-standing civil and environmental issues in their communities and fix them. And it doesn't cost that much either. Of course, we have those million-dollar budgets, but those are for the big companies. We're a small organization, we've only existed for a few years, and we're giving students those opportunities with only a few $100s to redo their school library, to fix the streets near their schools, to completely redo some problems that are in their communities that really need help. So what I want to see more of, especially with these older organizations, is letting youth do things. You've given them a voice, now let them do something.
Yeah. So that's an amazing call for action, right? Like, I mean, we're creating spaces that we want everybody to enjoy, especially our young people. They're going to live longer than all of us. How do we just not listen to them? How do we get them to do things? What's your experience been like in getting them motivated to do things and giving them the license, the agency to do things?
I think we got to create them learning environments and kind of stray away from the top-down models, because when we go with the top-down models, what happens is there's a lot of talk up there, but there's no action attached to the conversation. So in many cases, if we create those learning models where we take what the youth are saying, but attach that to actions which speak much louder than words, then what we do is we empower them. In fact, empower them in ways like I explained earlier, where we have a young man from our community, which many people just would never imagine. You know, a 28-year-old African Nova Scotian is actually in council right now. I couldn't fathom it 20 years ago myself. Even 5 years ago, I couldn't fathom it. So to actually be able to create those, once again, brave spaces that empower our youth to take action and then support them with the necessary resources and wrap them around them to encourage them to really be brave and take on those risks and those challenges. And remember that in many cases, failure are just, as we heard yesterday, a medicine for learning, right? So, I mean, ultimately, let's start attaching what we're talking about to actions, because as we all know, the cliche saying is actions speak louder than words.
Seema, when I was in public service in elected office and represented a downtown community, and we engage in conversations, and I remember youth was always the afterthought. I was like, oh, we got to get some young people involved. And their engagement was always sort of limited to if you were talking about a community center or you know, a athletic facility. But when we're talking about things like building affordable housing or accessible housing, they were not part of the conversation. Your views on that type of barriers, is that something that's just ingrained in us that we need to take out? How do we engage our young people in things that we may not think that they will be inherently interested in, but they have an important say in that placemaking?
Yeah, I think it's a common myth that most youth are not motivated and interested in these conversations. And so I would challenge that inherently. I think, you know, I was recently leading a national cross-country public engagement on anti-racism, which then led to a national anti-racism strategy. And I think from that experience and other experiences that I've done around community engagement, I think part of the problem is that we're not meeting people on their terms. We're not going out to where they are. We're not having the conversation in a way that they want to have it. It's, you know, hey, are you available to volunteer, I don't know, 3 hours of your time, unpaid, during your school hours or your job hours to come, you know, share your 2 cents on this thing that we're going to frame really bureaucratically, and, you know, like, it's just not an appealing ask.
Yeah.
For so many reasons. And so one thing that I love to do is partner with those credible messengers or the organizations that have been doing great work in neighborhoods. There was one in Halifax, I want to say the Dale Buddy Learning Center.
Delmore Buddy Day Learning Center.
Thank you, sorry, Delmore Buddy Day Learning Center.
Day Learning Center.
Thank you.
Afrocentric Learning Center, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, so we, for example, would partner with an organization like them where they have credibility that's been established with young people. They'll host it in a way that makes sense on a Saturday, providing honoraria, so, you know, folks who are perhaps working a part-time job can take the shift off to come share their views, and they'll frame it in a way that is inviting. So I think, you know, a lot of what yesterday came up for me was reframing who we think of as experts. And so I love the bottom-up approach that you're talking about. I think we have to think about who's in the community that has the expertise, that knows how to talk the talk that we may not necessarily, especially for young people. And let's put the money in their hands and let's give them the agency to design it how they want to design it.
Excellent. I want to come back to you. We're coming pretty close to the end of the session, so perhaps the last opportunity to ask a question or share a tactic, an experience that has worked for your particular community.
Hi, just a member of the community. But a question that I kind of grapple with, especially living in a multicultural city like Toronto, is that I wonder if, because we don't have a shared culture, if that kind of separates us. So we can experience and kind of dabble, do a little bit of tourism in other people's cultures, but how can we build a space where all of us are living close to each other, but not always with each other?
So I'd like to, so that's a really excellent question, and I think the one thing that I've learned in the work is fundamentally we're all connected by values. Values of respect, honesty, truth. Those are the foundations of building important places that we can share together, because once we have shared values, we have shared purpose. And once we have shared purpose, then we can do great things together. And I think that's the fundamental of those things, is that we all have been brought up with values, and then when we start looking at those things, I think we can really build, you know, really unique places that are inclusive. So.
Seema?
I feel like that's a whole other, it's an amazing question, and I feel like it's a whole day's discussion. But I think there are absolutely ways that we can have a shared sense of purpose and celebrate our own distinctions, and maybe we could chat over lunch. I feel it's a very, very big one, I think. I don't know, how can you tackle this for me?
For me, it comes down to the bare basics as one humankind. And when we remove the catalyst out of the equation, we all need water to live and food to survive. So at the end of the day, I think it comes down to just being human beings and accepting the fact that we are one species.
Yeah, and I would add to that is the power of story sharing. You know, and we're kind of getting away from that a lot because we're so much on our screens nowadays that, you know, you have a story and you have a story and you have a story and I have, and there's differences in those stories which makes us, I think, stronger, but there's a lot of commonalities in that story, and creating opportunities, creating, you know, public square, and I always think of that traditional public square that we're kind of losing, where people can come together from different backgrounds and be able to look at each other in each other's eyes and be able to tell a story or share a story. I think those are the opportunities, because that's how we create those common bonds, even though we may have different religion, different identities, or different cultures, etc. So yeah,
I just want to add one final thing in the conversation, because we heard it earlier. Love. It comes down to that one word. Just love, and loving each other in those spaces.
I think we've got one more person. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Shona. I'm from the Center for Social Innovation. Thank you. This has been incredible. One of the things that we have in looking at how to build communities from diverse backgrounds in a number of ways, of meaning that sometimes diverse subject matter area backgrounds, as well as what is more normally meant by diversity, is designing for collision. And one of those things around that is it's an opportunity to build empathy. If you want strong communities and if you want resilient communities, then you do have to have communities that have a certain level of empathy for one another. And that is often how you short circuit the cultural differences, because there is so much that we share. We share parenting. We share love. There ain't nobody out there that doesn't have love in their communities. And so if you give people an opportunity to sort of have design for opportunities for collision and get to have some of those face-to-face interactions, you can at times be able to take a step forward in resilient communities. But you do have to listen, and it does have to be iterative. And we have done great things there, and we have failed at that on occasion, and so we continue to learn.
Do you have any specific examples of, the listening part is so important, and do you have any specific examples of where you found that the techniques or the tactic of good listening worked and where it just absolutely just failed?
Yes, both, definitely. Probably our best sort of step forward in that was also in Regent Park. So we have a location in Regent Park. We moved into Regent Park with an understanding that if we are the Center for Social Innovation, we need to be looking at places where there is so much richness and so much innovation actually happening. And so we opened a location in Regent Park, and it has been a long learning process for us of listening, and is still a learning process for us of listening and creating those connections with the community, to not come in as an external satellite. So I think we tried a few things at the beginning of just saying we're great and do come in the door, without really hearing what people needed from us, that weren't quite as good as we needed them to be. And as we have been in that community a little bit longer, we have done a lot more reaching out to the community, going out into the community, and realizing that what we had to offer was supports, and making those supports available to the community so that that gathering could happen and that platform could actually raise.
Great, thank you. I think there's somebody behind me. Hi. Jennifer.
Yeah.
So I'm Jen. I'm from the Department of Imaginary Affairs. We root, yeah, you can all come ask me about that later. So we do root all of our work in storytelling, and we are asking for people to have public imagination and to really push themselves into thinking bigger. And we do that trying to do it without asking for permission to do it, doing it in a lot of creative ways. But then I wonder structurally, how do we carry stories to a policy level, to a place where we're no longer asking for permission, but the structures are already available for public imagination to exist?
Ooh, that's a good one. Okay,
Sure,
Aaron.
Last year, we made a fairly substantive investment in technology to tell stories, to capture stories. And as a planner, we're creating policy or informing policy. And so, policy typically follows words. You open up a book, but we're in a digital age where we can share a story. And in the work we do with communities, it's about talking about a policy, but just doing it through a video, where an elder can share in their own language the importance of that policy. And it doesn't have to be thou shall, thou should, or whatever. It can be about the importance of this place. It can be about the importance of making a change and be more informative, and it'll connect with more people by virtue of actually having a physical presence in their voice rather than reading the words, because I read a lot of policy. 6,000 and 7,000 pages of policy a year, most likely. So a lot of policy, but I think that we need to get into more visual communication and oral communication about how do we implement it. And I think ultimately I'd love to see policies be oral. Why do they have to be written all the time?
Can you get on it, Seema?
Yeah.
Policies being oral?
Can we get on it?
Yeah.
I would love to do that. We did an experiment actually with our colleagues out west who were experimenting with oral applications for grant funding, in particular for Indigenous, LGBTQ2+, and other marginalized communities. So definitely interested in seeing where else we can take this. I would also say that we have to do better as folks that are in the positions of power who are making policy, to listen better. And I would say, like I said at the beginning, I never imagined that I would be in this role ever, and I still, 3 years in it, wake up every day and kind of pinch myself. I'm like, am I really a public servant? I didn't imagine this for myself ever. And I think if there's any will for other folks to join either the elected side or the other side of the house, being a public servant, I think we just need to have more people that are coming from the grounds. We need to have more allies on the inside of these systems. We need to obviously work across sectors and across, organizations and all of that. But until the folks on the inside look more like the folks on the outside, the policy is never going to be as inclusive as it needs to be.
Very good point. So I think that's a great segue in sort of getting some of your concluding thoughts on the issue that we're talking about is how do you make inclusive places, how do we get people there who are going to use these spaces and places are the ones that are designing and driving it. I think we kind of talked about two competing things in our discussion today. One, the whole notion around trust and credibility and lived experiences and mobilizing them. But then on the other is the structures that we live in and the processes and the planning and the decision making. Parting thoughts on does one trump the other, or you find a way of bringing that together? What's your sort of takeaway or giveaway to the audience today as to how do you reconcile the two?
Actually, I wanted to comment on something Rodney shared with me yesterday, and it wasn't strong places, it's brave places. And I think that's what we need more of, is we need more brave places to speak our heart, to share wisdom and knowledge with each other in order to create difference in this world. And I would always say safe places, and when we met yesterday, you said brave places, because you can be safe. You can sit in the corner, and as we talked yesterday, you can be safe there. But it takes bravery to step up, sit on a stage, and talk about this, and to talk about how we can be brave together. So I'll leave it on that.
Great, thank you. Rodney.
When I think of bravery, the first thing that comes to my mind is courage. And when I seen them young people up there today, boy, was I ever flabbergasted. And I had to have a picture with them young people because, wow, is all I could say to them. And the work that they're doing is definitely ingrained in action, no question about it. And one of the things that I think about in bringing both of them together is collective impact strategies. Like going into these conversations with the intention to build on those strategies in an effective and efficient manner.
Thank you.
And one last thing, we have to always remember that, you know, our experts are the people closest to the issues. And Sigmund Freud told us many, many moons ago that, you know, knowledge is tied to experience in many cases. And my Afrocentric values and principles do not allow me to indulge simply in theory, and practice is where my heart lives. Just to put that out there.
Thanks, Rodney. Seema?
Okay, so people or processes and structures and policies. I would say in the short term, for sure, it's about the right people, and it's about having them, again, in the positions where they can actually have the agency to change stuff. But I think we've all seen so many organizations where amazing change has come about, and then the leader has moved on, and that's not really carried through. And so I think ultimately in the medium and long term, what matters is the creating of the blueprint, of whether that's changing the policies, whether that's rewriting the legislation, whether that's sharing orally with the rest of the staff so that the culture is shifting, whatever that looks like. I think the legacy has got to live outside the body of the people or the leader in order for the change to be actually really impactful and really sustainable.
Great. Wow. Thank you. Thank you to all three of you for a really engaging conversation and thought-provoking conversation. Yes, give them a big round of applause. I think so much of this stuff we think about, we want to do it, we see bits and pieces in the work we do, but to be able to bring the three of you and your varied perspectives and the manner in which you're able to practically do this work every single day is extremely meaningful, at least to me personally. And I want to thank all of you for being here and for participating. I hope you got some good ideas and good practical ways of building inclusive places and spaces in your respective communities as well. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.